This is Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm Adrian Buskey. I'm joined in this episode by author R.F. Kuang. Her debut novel, The Poppy War, was released earlier this year from Harper Voyager. It's an epic fantasy with roots in the 20th century history of China, and has won her the reputation in some literary circles as grimdark's darkest daughter. Rebecca, welcome to Fictitious.
Hi, Adrian. I am so excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you on here. We were on a panel together at San Diego Comic-Con, Here They Be Dragons, along with Jason Denzel and Tomi Adeyemi and Robert Jackson Bennett and Mary Pearson. It was just fantastic discussion about creating fresh voices in fantasy. And I was introduced to your work through a publicist right before that show, and having dived into the Poppy War, it's so good. And so I'm really, really excited to have you as part of this chat.
Oh, thank you so much.
It's awesome to see fantasy that pulls its influence from something besides kind of the same simple box of influences that we've seen for decades, the Tolkien trickle down and that pulling from European kind of background. So anytime that we get some fantasy that pulls from other influences, looks at other places in the world, and wants to explore some different kinds of groundwork and foundations, I think it's really, really cool. And I think you do that to great effect in The Poppy War.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this a little bit at the SDCC panel, but I think that the epic fantasy genre has gotten much, much better about diversity and representation, even just over the last decade. So we were talking about how The Poppy War isn't even the first epic fantasy set in China to be published by a top 5 publisher. I would say that's Ken Liu's Grace of Kings. So it's really cool to be riding the coattails of great authors who are already doing that cool stuff.
Well, I think it's an exciting time period in genre fiction in general, because we do have so many fresh voices entering this world. And I mean, those voices have always been out there, but they just haven't seen widespread publication in the past, particularly in the West. And so to have a time period where you are seeing a greater diversity in the people who write the books, that get published, that get visibility, that build fan bases, and the trickle down impact that will have on the next wave of genre fantasy readers and writers. I think it's an exciting time, and that fresh blood is really, really important. And I think that there's more people creating stories than kind of ever before. So there's a little something for everybody now. Can you tell me in your own words, at its core, what is the Poppy War about?
Yeah, so thematically, the Poppy War is about pain, revenge, and intergenerational trauma that draws a lot of inspiration from the history of Sino-Japanese relations. And plot-wise, I always describe it to people as Avatar: The Last Airbender, but if Azula was the main character and everybody is on drugs, because that is essentially what it is.
You had mentioned that on our panel at San Diego, and I had read, but ahead of the panel, I had read probably the first 100 pages in prep for the panel, but I was consuming 9 books at once, and it was a little, I don't know, schizophrenic for me for a little while there. But as I got home and have been digging into it further, it struck me, particularly once Rin, the main character, gets into the school. Is it Synagard?
Yeah, Synagard.
So this military academy, this extremely exclusive military academy that she basically has no social status in order to enter, and has gotten into basically purely on grit and rage. And there's a point where she encounters an instructor whose name is it Jiang?
Yes, Jiang.
Jiang, there was a point when they first started, those two characters first encounter each other and have a conversation. And in my mind, suddenly there was my visualization of the world made a full blown switch into animation. And I'm a huge animation fan, and my brain can kind of go there easily anyway. But there was a moment where I was like, oh, I can feel this as an animated series that swears a lot and has a lot of violence. But, I could see that in my head, where this character really kind of was this sort of animated character, this really fun and dynamic and odd character in all the best ways. And then I was it suddenly clicked into place, because I didn't feel that influence at first, and then it hit home with me. And I don't know, it made me, actually, every time that character is in quotes on screen in the book, it always makes me smile, and I really enjoy that.
Yeah, Jiang is really popular with a lot of readers. I look at reviews on Twitter sometimes, and people are I would die for him, and it's okay.
People on Twitter are very passionate about about who they stand for.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting who people will glom onto in a story, like who really speaks to them. And I mean, I think there's something refreshing when you have a character who is both a great repository of knowledge, but also rejects the stuffiness and rigidity of hierarchy and openly doesn't get along with the other teachers and has this sort of adversarial relationship with them. And I think that dynamic makes it really, really interesting. You know, when you mentioned Avatar: The Last Airbender, but on drugs, was Avatar like a big influence for you and your background? And like, you know, what other stuff kind of came into play as you were formulating the story?
Oh, definitely. Avatar was pretty huge, but it's funny because we didn't have TV channels when I was a kid, so I didn't get to watch Avatar at home. I'd have to go to my friends' houses and like catch whatever episodes were airing at the time, which meant that so I saw the Ember Island episode over and over again, which is, I don't know why they air it so much, but it's that episode where Azula and her friends are like on like an island resort, and it's sort of like separate from the main plot because they're not actively trying to kill Aang and his friends, but it's like Azula, who's one of the most powerful people in the universe, like playing volleyball games and trying to flirt with somebody and trying to learn how to be like a functional teenager, and failing miserably because like every time something goes slightly wrong, she starts lighting things on fire and like screaming at people. Which is like, so seeing Azula like that over and over again and seeing her moments of vulnerability made me really fall in love with that character type, which has stuck with me for all of these years. But I was also really influenced by manga, like every other Asian preteen in the 2000s. So I was really into Naruto, super into Bleach, and I think you'll find a lot of the same character archetypes carried over into the Poppy War, although I do try my best to subvert them. There's a character that's very much like Sasuke, and everyone I know who has read Naruto and both the Poppy War are like, oh man, this is Sasuke. But for anyone who's ever watched Naruto or read it all the way to the finish, which was a big commitment because it went on for a long time, Sasuke sucks. Like, I feel like a lot of people fell in love with him in the first 30 episodes because it's like, oh, he's so cool, like he's so hot, but then he's just like an asshole, and like he doesn't really get a redemption arc, or like the creators try to give him one and it doesn't resolve anything, and he never fully apologizes to anyone, especially Sakura, who he just like relentlessly abuses but marries anyways. So I wanted to play with that trope of like the hot, misunderstood genius who has the respect of everybody, but like, you know, give him the ending that he deserves, which is sort of a spoiler, but you know, you'll get there eventually. You'll see what I'm talking about.
I can guess who that character is, but I mean, Naruto was one that kind of missed me. I'm a little older, but I did watch Avatar and absolutely loved it, and I think it's really interesting, you know, seeing like the wave of fantasy creators, and you and Tomi both talked about this, like when we were on that panel, but the wave of creators now that their influences, the things that are affecting the way they write these stories in science fiction and fantasy are really pulled from animation and manga and you know, and there's things like Harry Potter and you know, Hunger Games and stuff like too that affected a whole different like generation on, you know, on a wide scale versus like earlier fantasy that was, you know, like Tolkien or Howard or Heinlein and some of these like classic like, you know, science fiction and fantasy authors and stuff. So I think it's really interesting to see the fingerprints of those things on these later works and seeing how they evolve further for, you know, for new audiences.
Yeah, I think that we also grew up in an era of globalized storytelling. Like, I don't really remember a world without the internet, which means that like we could access media from Japan and China. And like that was also the first time that those shows and stories were making cultural inroads into the West. So we grew up with so many more multicultural international influences than I think a lot of Western writers. So it's cool how my generation has then, you know, taken that and repackaged it into really like stunningly new stories, I think, and it's exciting to watch.
It's interesting that, like, with my generation, I'm 40, and I grew up in the 90s, with the 80s and 90s, and anime was just sort of coming to the States in a big way in the 90s. And so my corner of the nerd world was, like, desperately trying to get their hands on it. And it was, like, the time where, like, a 4-episode box set of something cost, like, $60, you know, like, to try to get your hands on, because we were a little bit pre-internet. But I think it was interesting that we were part of this generation that was actively, like, seeking out entertainment as American kids, like, seeking out entertainment from other countries, which I think think was maybe a little rare in the States before that time period. And then, yeah, like you're saying, like, once you hit like 2000, you hit the influx of manga, you have the influence of the internet, and this anime saturates the culture and has this huge impact on comics and storytelling and filmmaking and stuff. And now I think it's really interesting that you have, particularly like in YA audiences, but beyond that now, audiences that have a real thirst for diverse voices and want fresher stories and don't want to just hear the same thing over and over again. And that's part of what I think is a really exciting time in genre fiction, because the audience has the same hunger that the storytellers do, which is to find something new.
Yeah, definitely. I want to talk really quickly about the Hugos because they just happened and it's so exciting.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's not just that like diverse authors are putting their stories out, they're getting like massively good critical reception. Like N.K. Jemisin just won her 3rd Hugo, which is like legendary.
3-peat.
And it's so cool that like my generation of writers gets to grow up watching somebody succeed like that and having her as a role model. And Rebecca Rowanhorse won the Campbell Award and I think the Hugo for the best short story. And I believe she's the first Black Indigenous woman to do so in either category, which is like groundbreaking. So it's really cool not just to see these stories being published, but to be supported so widely by the genre community, especially because these people now are the heroes of everybody else who is like learning, like deciding they want to be a writer and looking on shelves and seeing their names and realizing that this path is open to them. And I don't think that's been the case like 30, 40 years before this. So that's just so awesome.
And it's great to see something like N.K. Jemisin, like, who has already had an enormous impact on new writers and writers that have been in the genre for decades, too, because her work is so influential. But is going to be one of those people going forward that, the next wave of authors, when you talk about who had an impact on they're going to be like, well, clearly N.K. Jemisin. I mean, like, everybody,
Yeah.
but that's a game changer. That's a huge switch in things. And I'm so excited that even though social media and Twitter can be this like cesspool of angry people with bad opinions, the fact that that she has a platform where she's able to, talk about this experience, talk about what it's like to, change the game in this kind of way, but what the troubles and difficulties that go along with it are too. I think that's an important part of the cultural conversation for her to be able to, speak her truth and communicate with other people who are in marginalized groups that are, fighting for that recognition. I saw Daniel Abraham retweet somebody, who'd said something where it was a guy who was like, it's not that we're giving out awards because we're trying to check quotas. It's that people of color and people of other ethnicities and people of marginalized backgrounds have been telling great stories all along. It's just now we're being allowed to pay attention to them.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Swinging back around to the Poppy War, this was your debut novel, right?
Yes.
What was your world building and outlining process for putting this together? I mean, did you already have a pretty established writing routine before digging into this book, or were you kind of learning on the fly? What was that process like?
Oh God, yeah, it was a giant mess. I'd never taken a creative writing course before I started writing the Poppy War. I'd been reading my whole life, which I think is just the best preparation for being a writer, but I had no idea how to go about outlining, constructing a novel. I didn't know the first thing about character creation or themes or plot or craft or anything. All I knew was that I was taking a gap year between my sophomore and junior years, and I had a job, but for the first time between the hours of 5 and midnight, I did not have any homework to do, which was a life-changing thing for me. So I decided I really wanted to finish a project during the year, and I thought that a novel would be the easiest thing to do because it didn't require the acquisition of too many new skills, or at least skills that I couldn't learn on my own, like coding or a musical instrument or something. So I saw this ad for Scrivener, and I was like, this looks really cool. So I got it. So really the technology came before the product, which is never the case, but Scrivener really guided my writing, the formation of my writing process, because then I learned about things like word count and how to organize scenes, etc. So I got that, and I had read somewhere that if you want to actually finish a novel, one of the best things you can do is just set regular word count targets. So I was like, okay, I have so much time, I'm going to write 2,000 words a day, which is stupid high, and something I definitely cannot meet now, especially now that I'm back at school and about to start graduate school. But back then that seemed very doable, and I was consistently hitting it. And then at the same time, I bought a lot of books on craft online by authors I just really loved. So while I was constructing the world and the plot and the characters of the Poppy War, So you know how in good books about craft, there's always like, oh, now here's a character building exercise. I would just do those exercises, and my responses to the exercises became everything in the Poppy War. So it was all just like a giant mess, and I'm honestly shocked that it came into a coherent plot and world and storyline. But I mean, the other reason why my storytelling process is really messy is because I think thematically. So I do history, and I'm also a debate coach. So I think in terms of arguments, right, and overarching historical themes before I think about the particulars. So I knew based on the conversations that I'd had with my grandparents and the texts on Chinese history that I'd been reading that I wanted to do something about the Second Sino-Japanese War, which is essentially just World War II in Asia, just nobody knows about it. And like the lingering historical themes of brutality and atrocity and the failure to account for those atrocities and the way that they shape generations thereafter, which, you know, is really abstract and doesn't translate directly into a plot. And the other thing I knew was that I didn't want to write it in the 20th century proper because that felt too close to what my grandparents had just gone through, and the fantasy element sort of shields you from the direct emotional impact of that. Right. And also just because, like, fantasy is really cool. And so, like, there were a lot of details if I'd written it in the 20th century that I would have had to check with my grandparents, which would have meant, like, long discussions that I don't think that they were emotionally ready for. But with fantasy, you can just make up whatever details you don't have, and you can insert yourself into situations and come up with your own answers to how you would react in bad situations instead of forcing somebody else to recount their story. So I knew all of that. So I was like, okay, fantasy, ancient China sounds vaguely good. Sort of arbitrarily picked the Song Dynasty because it was technologically, well, not arbitrarily, I had good reasons. It was like technologically and economically advanced enough that it would be fairly easy to construct a military campaign with the same speed and scale that 20th century battles were happening. And it's like they didn't have guns, right? And they didn't have tanks, and they obviously couldn't fly places. But it's very different for an army to be able to sail quickly somewhere than for them to have to walk everywhere like they would have had to if I'd chosen a couple of earlier dynasties. So yeah, then I had the Song Dynasty and I was like, okay, now we have a place and we have some themes. And then I read an autobiography or biography of Mao Zedong, the dictator who wrecked China. And then I got really interested in the question of how somebody goes from sort of this backwater peasant fellow to a genocidal dictator, because that's a massive emotional journey, right?
Big leap, yeah.
Yeah, so then I was like, okay, now I have a main character. Like, I have the person who ties all of these themes together. So finally I had a character and a world and a semi-plot. And then everything started coming together after that. But it was very, like, messy, find things as you go. And I don't know how to do things differently. And I don't know if that's great advice. But I guess the advice is if you feel incredibly messy in how you construct novels, I think that's very normal for a lot of writers. So, yeah, I have no method. I can only recount chaos. But yes, that is what happened.
Well, I like that you mentioned Scrivener, because you do have, like, you know, a software program that gives you a great deal of structure if you want it, but also a great deal of flexibility to move things around and learn. So I do think it's interesting the software kind of came ahead of the writing process. I think for most people, it's some sort of gigantic mess ahead of time, and then they're trying to shove it into another system and figure out how to make it work for them. So you might have actually gotten really lucky doing it in the reverse.
No, I definitely did, especially because I can't write chronologically. I just get really bored. Like, because I'm a big picture writer, so I have to see how things are fitting in thematically all the time, which means that, like, in a given writing session, I'll write a couple words in, like, the very last scene and then jump around to, like, the climaxes of different acts, and then, like, work on the connective tissue between the acts. You can't really tell beforehand really what order that a lot of stuff is going to come in. So the fact that you can just, like, drag and drop things in Scrivener is huge, because if I were trying to do that in Microsoft Word, right, like, I think that there's a lot of, I don't know if status quo bias is the word for it, but, you know, like, a reluctance to edit the existing structure of a work if you have it in Word and you're only seeing it one-dimensionally. And it just, like, seems like a huge hassle to move something, but in Scrivener, it feels really easy. So I felt like I had that freedom going in, which is why I have the writing process that I do, which is really messy and really time-consuming because there's no order and it requires a lot of cleanup on the back end. But I can't force myself to write from outlines, otherwise I get too bored.
So you would qualify yourself as more of a pantser?
Oh, definitely. I think so. I'm an outliner in the sense that I know what has to happen in all of the acts and how they all have to tie together. But in terms of like how we get from point A to point B, like the scenes just sort of discover themselves along the way. It's really like, what am I in the mood for? Like what seems cool aesthetically right now is what's going to go in whatever chapter. But like that process has worked very badly for books 2 and 3. At least like that degree of flexibility that I had for book 1, because like the storyline of book 1 is fairly simple, right? But like then like the problem with trilogies is that you have all these existing plot lines that then have to be resolved at different stages, and you don't get to just make things up as you go anymore. So I've had to learn how to outline a lot of things. I didn't know how to outline anything before I started writing book 2, which is why it's taken as long as it has. Like I'm just now doing what I hope will be like the last round of structural revisions. But like once I understood that my mess of a process doesn't work so well for trilogies, book 3 was far more structured and planned, and writing that has been way easier. But yeah, God, I hate outlining. It's really hard.
Just last night, I was talking to Robert Jackson Bennett. His new book, Foundryside, just came out a couple of days ago, and he's working on the sequel to it. And he echoed something you said there, which is that like writing the sequels is so much harder. And you would think, I mean, I think from an outsider's perspective, you're like, well, you did the world building, you did the groundwork, like the heavy lifting happens in the first book, and afterwards you can just kind of run with it. But I think that on the flip side of it, particularly if like you're working on a book where the first novel has been very successful and very well received, and you have built a fan base out of it, and now there's this additional pressure to not suck because because the first one has done so well, and you don't want a sophomore slump into it. But also, by the end of a first novel, you've usually raised the stakes pretty significantly, and now you have to figure out how to take something from humble beginnings and carry on in bigger ways, and it can definitely be a challenge.
Oh yeah. No, I think second book syndrome, I think there are a lot of causes of it. The pressure to live up to the reception of the first book is definitely real. I think I actually got lucky because there were 2 years in between when Harper bought the trilogy and when the book came out, that I had so I had time to write the sequel in relative silence, because reviews weren't coming out yet. But even though the book is largely finished now, I don't read reviews on Goodreads, but you sort of can't escape reader reactions because they tweet at you, and it's very well intentioned, and it's really awesome when somebody tells me they liked it. Yeah. But when they talk about their expectations for certain characters or what they think is going to happen, or what they really want to happen, it gets in your head, and you start rethinking plot decisions that you made a long time ago, and that can be hard. The second thing I think is what you said, raising the stakes and building it into an even larger storyline. I think I also got lucky in that regard, in that I knew exactly how the third book was going to end before I finished the first book. And the second and third books are the books that I'd wanted to write. And I almost felt like the first book, I sort of just had to get out of the way to establish everything and set everybody up. It's it all felt like backstory. So I didn't have trouble coming up with plot lines or how to raise the stakes. And I know that a lot of people do. So I think I dodged a bullet there. But the biggest thing for me was you sort of forget how to write. I think for a lot of people, their first novels, you can say you wrote it in 6 months, but really, I always read a lot of pieces of advice that are your first novel takes 10 years, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's all the time you spend thinking about craft and writing and the plotline and the stories. So it's unfair to compare books 2 and 1. And that's true. But also, all the little things in the process that went into learning about craft and plot for book 1 sort of just felt discovered along the way. And then I felt like I didn't know how to replicate any of that, and that I just lucked into it, which is not quite true. I do have craft skills and I know how to write. I just had convinced myself that I'd forgotten all of them. The analogy I like is, have you read his Dark Materials, the Philip Pullman trilogy, The Golden Compass?
I read The Golden Compass, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So you know how Lyra sort of instinctively knows how to use the alethiometer? Nobody has ever taught her. She just does it. At the end of the trilogy, she loses that skill for whatever plot reason, and then she has to learn from scratch and actually read books and do exercises and drill into herself how to do this thing that she'd sort of been doing on autopilot. And that is what I had to do, because now I didn't know which tools I could trust and which instincts were wrong. So I got really lucky because I went to Odyssey the summer right after I sold the first book, and which is a 6-week writing workshop in New Hampshire led by Jean Cavellis, and that was just 6 weeks of relentless drilling. in all the craft tools that a lot of them I had been playing instinctively without knowing why or how. And I finally learned their names, and I learned how to employ them with deliberation instead of just like sort of lucking into scenes. So that whole process was a really difficult period of growth and learning, becoming self-aware about my writing techniques instead of just doing them. But it was really necessary, because once I got over that, then I could write a book and feel confident about it and be able to sort of objectively evaluate whether the writing was good or not, instead of just feeling my way through things like I had with book one. So it was really hard, but I think that, yeah, that is necessary growth. And I think just sort of inevitably happens to everyone. And it's good to know that it's about to happen before you go in, which a lot of people had told me. So I didn't like break down and have like existential crises about my abilities as a writer, which I know a lot of people do.
A lot of imposter syndrome. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, you make a good point there about the whole, like, your entire life to prepare for the first book. Sometimes it's like lightning in the bottle for people, and they're like, oh, well, I got it done, and now, oh gosh, like, now I have to kind of do this with intention and and do this for real. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot like musicians when they put out their first record, they've been working on that since they were kids, and then their second record's like, oh, this is all from scratch. What do I do now?
Right, exactly.
You're relatively young as a published author, and, you know, and this is your debut novel, and from your account there, it sounds like, you know, the first time you dived into anything this big. And yet, like, you have very graceful prose, you have very descriptive, you know, language. Like, it's a sophisticated narrative writing style. But I think it's interesting though, but from your characters, they have, I'll call it very naturalistic dialogue. They talk like people talk. You know, sometimes if you get an author who has, you know, a very colorful kind of language, you see that kind of like in the speech, like it can be a little flowery or idiosyncratic. And with your characters, I feel like the voice of them feels like people that, you know, they react like you would think, you know, people would. And in particular with Rin, she has WTF moments that are like very much in line with any teenager or new adult who, you know, is trying to deal with the things that are, you know, far too big for them really to handle. How did you approach, you said you did a lot of these like character description projects and stuff out of some of these books and stuff, but how did you approach developing the language and voice of your world and characters?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because the sort of naturalistic slang has gotten very mixed reactions from readers. Like, a lot of older readers will be like, this bothered me. Like, I don't like it when people talk like they're in the 21st century, but they're purportedly in a fantasy novel. And I noticed readers my age just have no problem with it and think it's awesome. And it actually really wasn't a deliberate decision. I was just writing dialogue because I had not read much about how to construct dialogue. The only rule I had was that you can't use words that cannot exist in the world because they refer to things that haven't been invented yet. So words like concrete, automatic, like a lot of things that refer to modern technology. I was like, you can't have that because that doesn't make sense. But otherwise, they can have the full range of expressions that young people use to talk about themselves. Because I think I was trying to accurately translate just like feelings and emotions between people and express them the way we would now, as opposed to staying more true to I guess what we would see as more stilted dialogue of the Song Dynasty. I guess an interesting analogy would be, have you seen Baz Luhrmann's Great Gatsby film? It's really awesome. I love it, but I think it came out in like 2012 or 2013. But the whole soundtrack, I think, is mostly by Jay-Z, and it's like modern rap music, but still in like 1920s New York, because it's trying to evoke the aesthetic of like wealth and luxury and feeling on top of the world, but in terms that we would understand now, as opposed to like music from the 20s. And I think that is sort of what the dialogue is trying to do. But this is not something I thought about consciously before I wrote it. I just wrote it. And I actually read a really interesting blog post a couple of weeks ago by a writer I know named Phoebe Barton. And she had done a review of The Popular One. And she said, this book is epic fantasy for millennials, because it's written by a millennial on the younger side, I guess. And it's in dialogue in terms that millennials understand, as opposed to older fantasy where everybody's trying to evoke Tolkien. So yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't know if people should speak more formally. There are, I guess, odd moments where people do, and it does sound like they are in an ancient Chinese wuxia film, but otherwise, like, the important thing is that they're kids and they're going through terrible things, and they're also students and they have rivalries. So those aspects of their personality were more important for me to capture than to make them sound like they were in a Shakespeare play.
I think a lot of fantasy fans that have been, you know, reading in the genre for decades and decades have a more rigid idiom for what their worlds are supposed to look like and sound like. And again, like, I think if you look at the influence of animation and anime and manga, but then even things like, I mean, like when I was in college, we were watching Hercules and Xena Warrior Princess on TV, you know, and those were fantasy epics where people talked in modern day vernacular. And, you know, if you watch something like an Avatar, watch a lot shows like, say, like something like Full Metal Alchemist, which is kind of, you know, takes place in an industrialized fantasy world, things like that. Like, you have more modern speech in these fantasy worlds. And so I think, you know, your younger readers don't blink at it because that's an idiom that's already been presented to them. But I can see how, an older audience is like, but that's not how you talk in ancient world. And like, it's a fantasy world. That's the thing that makes me crazy sometimes with fantasy audiences, is that they're like, these are literally secondary worlds. They're literally places that you're creating from whole cloth. They can sound like anything. They don't have to be held to this traditional idea of coming out of some sort of re-envisioning of King Arthur or whatever. Like, we can make them whatever they want them to be.
Yeah, I think it's not just the slang too. I think it is also a matter of attitude, because a lot of modern fantasy, I guess we can sort of arbitrarily designate this as modern, although that's a bad name. Like, modern fantasy characters are flippant towards things. They're casual. They like curse more easily. And it's just like, I don't want to say jaded, but they approach things with this sort of absurdist humor that you find in Tumblr memes, right? Which is not to say that like they don't take their fight seriously, but They also like have fun and like make fun of people, and it's awesome. And like, that doesn't happen in the old stilted dialogue. People are like, you are my blood brother. We are bonded on this quest. I love you in a non-gay way, but actually in a gay way. And like, the Dark Lord is evil. We don't like him. And like, they never make like fart jokes about him, right? Because that would totally kill the aesthetic. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that means that millennials are uniquely rude or don't take things as seriously. It's just like, this is humor and this is how we express ourselves, right? And I think that like adds a lot of like shades of nuance to characters, and just like makes dialogue and scenes more fun and interesting to read, especially because like Black humor is it's not even like a millennial thing. It's like a way that a lot of societies, especially like Chinese cinema, have used to deal with horrific atrocities, right? So it's nice to see more of that.
Yeah, and we know like gallows humor has always been a thing, you know, all the way back to Shakespeare and stuff, you know, but every work is a product of its time. And so, yeah, I think you make a good point there that a lot of the works coming out now come from a time period where, you know, we express ourselves differently as a culture, interpersonally. You have all these like sort of like landmark changes whenever, like for me, it was as teenager seeing like Kevin Smith's Clerks come out, because it was the first time in a film I had seen anybody who talked like my friends.
Oh my gosh, I loved Clerks.
Yeah, you see that in Mallrats and stuff. It's funny to look back on it now because I think about being like a suburban white kid with a bunch of suburban white friends, and we were like, oh my gosh, we were represented on screen. You know, like it hadn't happened a lot, but it was the first time we'd see like our sort of like geek vernacular on the screen in a way that we recognize as authentic. You know, over the years, like, you know, we see this development, like you said, it's sort of like Tumblr voice, or, you know, the discourse that has popped up a lot, you know, online and with people, and it has an impact on the way, you know, people relate to those characters. And I think also with like particularly the impact of urban fantasy as well as like young adult, where you see this representation of a lot of snarky characters, a lot of characters with a very cynical outlook, and a lot of, you know, fast paced, you know, kind of dialogue, and the influence particularly of films, I think, with that too. So you have this whole generation of people who write what I think of sometimes as movie dialogue. It's the kind of thing that you kind of want to read out loud with a friend because it's so good and so quick. And yeah, it isn't, like you said, isn't that stilted, formal Tolkien kind of thing.
Yeah, it's precisely why MCU films are awesome and DC sucks. Like they crack jokes, like they're facing extinction and they're like, okay, let's make a fart joke now. Like, oh my god, have you seen Infinity War?
Yes.
Okay, you know that sequence that's like, where is Gamora? Like, who is Gamora? I'll do you one better. Why is Gamora? Like that's like the classic Tumblr meme, right? Like that's so good. I think it's the ability to not take ourselves so seriously, and also just to like grapple with the absurd, which is not that like older generations don't have a sense of humor. It's just like, this is a very different flavor and we express ourselves differently now. Like, I think, like, crotchety, like, old readers are like, oh, you young people, like, don't take anything seriously. Like, you think the whole world is a joke to you. And it's like, no, that's not quite the case. It's like, we take things very seriously. And we have grown up with, like, the looming threat of environmental extinction. So, like, like, things in the world matter a lot to us. It's just, like, humor, I think, is a coping mechanism to make that more bearable.
100%. Yeah, I mean, we have to have some way to deal with a dumpster fire of a world. Yeah, and that's like you said, it's a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
Were there any like real significant challenges in this book that you remember, like something that that you just ran your head against over and over again that had to evolve 3 or 4 times, like without getting too much into spoiler territory, but anything specific you remember that was really, really difficult and that you found a particular fix for?
I think the later chapters were really difficult for me to write because they're extremely dark. And they're about war atrocities and, horrible things happening to innocent people. And that is just like not like, I think I'm a pretty positive person and I do not like thinking about that all the time, which I study military history, so I'm maybe in the wrong field. But it's just like, it's hard. I honestly don't know how a lot of grimdark authors do it and just like produce like pages and pages of blood and gore, because it like really bothers me. So usually I can it's easy for me to revise a chapter and go through and fix its weaknesses, but I just really didn't even want to read those passages again. It was hard enough writing them out the first time. So I would just, especially because it hit so close to home, that's my family history. So yeah, I would cringe and type up something and then stand up and be like, wow, so much labor for the day. Oh my gosh, I'm done now. And then I would just go take a walk and listen to K-pop or watch The Office or something. Cause I just don't like thinking about that for too long. And books 2 and 3 get darker. So the challenge for me has been portraying those things with the same sort of empathy and care as every other scene, but just taking care of myself mentally. So it's been a challenge, but I also have a really good support system and a wonderful boyfriend who isn't even a genre fan. So it's easy to compartmentalize and pop up from the writing world and think about something else for a while. But yeah, I think that's really important. I think especially if you write pretty dark materials, it's I think this happens to a lot of creators. It starts affecting you mentally, and sometimes it can be really bad. So yeah, self-care was a lesson that I had to learn, but I think I'm pretty good at it now.
I like that you mentioned that you holding on to empathy while you're writing those dark sequences and writing violent passages and stuff. Sometimes grimdark fantasy fiction tends to get a rap for being very celebratory about the violence and really reveling in the darkness of those stories. And I think those stories work a lot better when you can understand that this isn't it's sweet, that totally broke that dude's bones and sticking out of his leg. I love that visual.
Yeah.
I don't know why I use that voice, but but that kind of oh, isn't it awesome? This is revolting and disgusting and mega violent, and I'm just so excited about that because that is a little freaky. But yeah, having that still remembering these characters are supposed to be people and that this is suffering and this is difficult. And I feel when you've got the really good grimdark authors, say a Joe Abercrombie, that can write that stuff while still giving you a very direct look at the people involved and how it's not it's super fun to be a badass hero, kicking butt and taking names all the times, because you talk about taking, self-care for yourself as a writer, the characters themselves are suffering even just to be able to accomplish things that they do, and being cognizant of that makes a much deeper narrative.
Yeah, definitely.
Rebecca, this has been great. I'm been really excited to dive deeply into this and see your thoughts on it, especially as a debut novelist and seeing your growth and evolution from somebody who just dived into this and learned the craft as she went. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you're feeding your brain right now, whether it's TV or film or books, things that are actively inspiring you, or even if it's ongoing writer education, anything you can recommend in that vein?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So I realized recently that the very best thing you can do for yourself when you have writer's block is to just read a lot of really good fiction, because then that's textbook examples of how do I get past this craft issue, how do I do this scene transition, and it just gets you amped up for writing and also fuels your brain with cool ideas and characters. So I try to read at least one nonfiction book and one fiction book a week just to discipline myself to do that. And good stuff I've read recently, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. It's been really popular. It's like gay and glamorous and amazing, and I loved it. Zero Sum Game. Oh, so I also run this review blog that focuses on books coming out by Asian authors and written by Asian reviewers. So I read a lot of arcs for that, and almost everything I've read for it has just been stunning. The Incendiaries by Kuang just came out. It was incredible. Girls of Paper and Fire by Natasha Nyan. I think you pronounce her last name. I have to double check, but that comes out in October. It's a YA about queer girls resisting imperial powers and their demons and magic, and it's just so good. That's as far as books go. But podcasts I really like, 88 Cups of Tea by Yin Chang. I was recently on it and I hadn't heard of it before, but then I went back and listened to the backlog because the host is just so good. But I was just like so amazed by her interviewing skills. So I went back and listened, and it has interviews with a lot of high profile, mostly YA authors, I think. And I think that, like, this podcast also concentrates on craft tips and the writing process. So I would highly recommend that.
88 Cups of Tea?
Yes.
That's really cool.
I don't have to recommend Fictitious because if they're here, they're already listening to it.
Yeah. Hopefully. Yeah.
Like, I could go on and on about great books I read recently, but I also want to say, like, obviously, the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. I know I talked about this a lot on the panel, but it is that good. Like, it is, I think, the definitive work of epic fantasy, at least for this decade. I'd be surprised if it weren't in, like, the top 10 for this century. And it's just it's so deep and complex and approaches issues in such a novel way. And I think it should be like foundational reading for any new fantasy writer.
You mentioned that you have that review blog. What was that called? Oh,
it's called Journey to the Best. So it's new, and we only have one review up because we try to put them out the week that books come out. But there are a lot of amazing books coming out this fall by Asian authors, and we've reviewed all of them, and we do Q&As with them. So yeah, so there will be a lot more content coming out in the next couple months. And yeah, the reception to it has been really good. I'm excited. I think like learning how to review books also is very important for being learning how to write well, because then you can identify what things work and what gets you excited and sort of incorporate that into your own craft. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
I think that's a really good note, because when you start to look at the mechanics of other people's books, you can identify places where, oh, this really works, or, oh, this doesn't work, especially if you find something that, like, a book that is maybe like 90% great, but you can see that 10% where things aren't functioning as well as maybe you'd like them to be. And that can be really informative for your own writing process, to step back and be like, oh, do I do something like that? Do I is this a place where I fail, and can I shore up my own writing by paying attention to that?
Oh yeah, definitely. Like, it also helps so much with writer's block, because sometimes you get hung up on these scenes and you don't know how to transition from one scene to the next or how to resolve it. And then you read this great book that like does that seamlessly. And then it's like a spark of inspiration. Like, you know exactly how to fix your own work now. And that happens to me all the time. Like, I always get writer's block, and then I read somebody amazing, and then I'm like, this is it. Like, I know how to do it now. I think like pacing is the most important thing that I like. It's what's helped me the most, like realizing how people like schedule events and like jump from one plot point to the next, because sometimes you can get so lost in the drudge of your manuscript that it feels so slow and boring, and like that fun like zipping from one location to the next, like that isn't there anymore. And then you read like a really interesting action sequence, and then you're like, okay, this is what I need. Like, I need that same sort of energy, and then you figure out how to import it in. So yeah,
I think that's why it's good to continue reading books on craft, even after you've been in the field for a while, because occasionally just getting somebody else's like new vision of how to solve problems, it's like it may not be something you use every day, but it might fix that one problem that you're hitting at just the right time, so it's like it's still good to kind of explore what those other methodologies are and continue growing all the time.
Oh yeah, I definitely believe that you're never done learning and growing as a writer, and you should always try to be focused on improving your craft. And like, things don't end the moment you get your first book published. Like, you can still be a bad writer. And like, I really hope that The Poppy War is the worst thing I ever write, because if it's not, then that means that I get worse from where I was when I was 19, which would be really embarrassing. So yeah, it's just really awesome to constantly set the bar higher for myself by reading authors I really admire.
Well, you are currently working now on The Dragon Republic, right? That's the
Yes.
the next novel.
Yes, we have a title finally.
Going forward, where should people be following you and your work? Where are the best places to keep up with you?
You can subscribe to my author website. That's just www.rfkuang.com. Otherwise, I'm fairly active on Twitter at KuangRF or on Instagram, where I just post a bunch of pictures of my dog. But those are important life updates too.
Absolutely, yes. And I'll make sure that we'll have the links to all those sites and for your review site on the blog for this episode. Rebecca, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting dive into your work. I'm really excited to have had you on and to get to explore this stuff. Like I said, I mean, I've been really enjoying the Poppy War, and I'm just really stoked to see where your career goes next.
Oh my God, thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Fictitious is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Buskey, and co-produced by Wendy Buskey. You can find more episodes of the show at fictitiouspodcast.com. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram as Fictitious Pod. And you can always come talk to me on Twitter, where I tweet as @AdrianBuskey. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.